IVM.
Before we begin, here's a quick announcement. Design Up Conference is back with the energy, the inspiration, and the excitement for the sixth year. 25 speakers over 2 days, 8 unconference events, and endless networking on 17th and 18th of September in Namma, Bangalore. Be there, check out the buzz, the speakers, register now on 2022.designup.io. This is Audiogyan, and I am your host, Kedar Nimkar. Welcome to a deep dive into the minds of luminaries from the Indian creative world. This Audiogyan is in association with the Drawing Board. The Drawing Board is an international architecture platform based in India where students can test their understanding and skills in shaping the way communities live and thrive while preserving local heritage. The Drawing Board has been actively running architecture competition for undergraduate students since 2016. It was conceptualized by Mindspace Architects and Rohan Builders. This year, they are back in action with a live event. Architecture undergrad students can submit their project ideas on the theme of designing a memorial for Charles Correa. Last date to submit your concepts is 1st of October 2022. More details in the show notes and thedrawingboard.in. Today we have one of the jury members with us on Audiogyan, the well-known Cape Town-based architect and urban designer, Henri Comrie. Henri is a minimalist, or should we say reductivist? We'll explore that in the conversation. He's an architect and an urban designer who enjoys working through complex problems to arrive at simple and logical solutions that hold wide appeal. He's a founding partner at URBA URBA Architects and urban designer from Cape Town, South Africa. Henri has been practicing architecture for nearly 3 decades. He was a lead urban designer for FIFA World Cup Stadium in Cape Town and several large mixed-use precincts, as well as architect for several prominent educational and residential buildings across a range of scales. Today we'll try and document some of his thoughts on minimalistic, as I said, reductivist architecture, and a bit about what is good architecture according to him and what will he be evaluating in the entries at the drawing board competition. So that was a long intro, but thanks, Henry, for giving your time, and it's a real honor to have you on the show.
Thank you, Kedar. And from my side, such a privilege to be invited to adjudicate. There's always something to learn, and I'm sure I'm going to be learning a lot in visiting India for the competition.
Awesome. So yeah, as on the backdrop of the drawing board, we'll have few questions in the end, but just wanted to understand your philosophy and your definition of architecture. And I've come up with like few questions based on my sort of preliminary research. Would love to explore what's in the conversation. So first, I'll start off with asking, say, like a very basic definition just to set context is what's your definition of architecture? And this has been my classic question because as people grow in their careers and have more experience, the definition changes, the worldview changes, the understanding or the reflection happens. So yeah, what's your definition and how has it changed, or has it changed over 3 decades?
Thanks for the question, Kedar. Yeah, I think that the definition of architecture is always going to be subjective. If you ask two different architects, they'll have a different definition. If I ask you, you'll have a different definition to me. And that's healthy because it's all about diversity in the end. So there's a place for somebody like me calling myself a minimalist, as you say, we'll explore that. And then somebody else saying that they this or that or the other in terms of their approach. You use the term reflective. It's a very appropriate term as far as I'm concerned. The older you get, the more you value that definition or that term in the context of architecture. When you're young, you just start practicing. You think you're there to learn to build a building. And if you can do it technically, you're an architect, and that's good enough. And so we're all a bit naive at that level of our development. And you become, in a way, infatuated by things. You get influenced by things very quickly, but you haven't seen much. And so as you develop as an architect and you start practicing, but at the same time looking, traveling, studying, doing postgraduate studies, for me going to India, your view of architecture constantly evolves and changes. I think in the world of architecture, you'll have signature architects that get, in a way, trapped in a certain signature, and people come to them for that style or that way of working. For me, that's not an appropriate way of seeing architecture, because in a way it's boring, it's limiting, it closes down things, it closes down options, it closes down your ability to meet different types of clients, to work for different communities and so on. So my view, and it's also maybe because I'm from South Africa, with our own challenges, is one of listening. I mean, we've made many mistakes in this country where people professed. It's now our turn, all of us, to learn and to listen and to absorb cultures and so on. So in terms of that, but just the question you've asked, how's architecture evolved? I think it's evolved for good and bad. I think systems have come into it with sustainability consciousness. But practices are massively large now. They're global. Some practices have 3,000 people working in it. So the chance of getting hold of somebody like me, who has an identity, becomes more and more difficult. So Foster and Partners, you'll have one Foster. Everybody wants to talk to Foster, and Foster says, I just can't get around to everybody. I've got an office of 3,000 people. So that connection of architecture to individuals in the identities, the Doshis, is becoming, the Louis Kahns, the Charles Correas, is becoming increasingly difficult, not only in India, but globally. So that sort of looking up towards an architect and in a way hanging on to their words and their wisdom is becoming difficult. We're all hanging onto the systems now, and the systems often improve sustainability, but it also bullies us because you arrive at the office and the machine tells you what to do. You have to log in, and it gives you certain algorithms, artificial intelligence. Elon Musk believes we all want to go to Mars. I don't want to go to Mars. I'm happy on Earth. So in a way, technology is forcing the definition of architecture, and then also the image. For me, good architecture is not something that blows you away. It's something that you're fond of. And what I'm saying with that is good architecture sustains your interest through the way that you engage with it. It's not something that you appreciate at a distance as an object. And a lot of the appreciation of architecture now is through the object. People look at their Instagram post, they scroll through it, and they look at these images, which is actually very superficial. It's just the external form of the building. It's not about the on the ground, everyday experience of every person that we are accountable to as architects in the way that we design space. So that we've got that responsibility. So I think it's changed enormously. So I'm in a way still a bit old school, old fashioned, and maybe I'm also too old to change now. I've said that quite often. You in a way get you get sort of fixed in your ways. And again, it has its benefits, it's got its upsides, and it's got its downsides.
Very interesting. But then we have this sort of, I'm sure there's a principle across disciplines within the design field as well. That good design is almost invisible design, right? So then when you talk about making identities or making people sort of connect with it, so how do you try and like strive for that balance that the place is invisible yet it is very comforting, or maybe
Yes,
inclusive, or maybe I mean, yeah,
yes,
sustainable is again now abused, but you know what I mean.
yes. Yes. Firstly, I do agree with you. This thing about working in teams is becoming more important, and the fact that we acknowledge that our own knowledge is limited, and so there will always be people who are more technically minded, people that are more proficient at certain things, that can calculate the benefits of a building. Say, environmentally, it goes into a spreadsheet, and it's almost unquestionable. I think the other part, the almost spiritual part of architecture, the artistic side of architecture, is something that I hang on to. I still believe that an architect has to have that passion, like you would have for art, to go to an art gallery, not for any superficial reason. You just want to be inspired by the piece of art. So, as the other definition for in terms of architecture and in the context of it, what you've just asked, a good architecture for me is architecture that seems like it's always been there. It's almost like you can take the author out of it because it's so well thought through in terms of people's relationship with form and space that it's not who was the architect. It's just something, and for me, I love to go back to buildings that I've designed, to campuses and to that World Cup Stadium precinct, for instance, to see how people use the space. So to become a fly on the wall, I don't walk around there saying, I designed this and profess that or stand on a stage. That is the last thing I'd like to do. But I found, ironically, just while I'm on that topic, the last time I was at a campus where I did two buildings, the students started coming to me and they asked me, am I the architect? And I said to them, how do you know that? Because they said, people don't generally take so many pictures of buildings, they said to me. So, so that does still happen. But this thing about good architecture being nuanced, gentle, because that's just what people expect. And in terms of money and commodity, you always have clients that want to boast with their house or their head office building and so on. But that's just a very small portion of people that populate the earth. The rest of the population have no interest in that. So architects tend to overemphasize that demand on the skill of an architect to create iconic stuff, which is glossy, which is full front or whatever you want to call it, stuff which is sort of very immediate and direct. Most people just walk in the city. They're not really interested in the architects who did it, but they love the city. They love the spaces in the city. And I always say, if you build good streets, you build good cities, because we experience, if I travel to Paris, I don't walk around there with my notebook trying to figure out who did every building. By chance, I know who did the Eiffel Tower, and it was done by Eiffel, right? Is in the name. But generally, I go there and enjoy the spaces. So, and those are collections of buildings that are generally background. We call that background architecture. It's like if I wore a colorful shirt, I can't wear a colorful tie because the colorful tie will just disappear. So you actually sometimes need to accept that you need more white shirt than colorful tie, if I have to use a metaphor. So because you still need the tie, the colorful tie, that's cool. That there will always be some sort of a demand for that. You buy it at the airport lounge, colorful tie. I love the tie. But as I say, you have to have the white shirt. So in architecture, it's no different. And one might say, well, that's not architecture. It's only the tie that's architecture, which is for me not true. And that comes through urban design. That comes through my urban design. But we can get to that. I think that's one of your other questions.
Yeah. It's so brilliant because I can see a lot more interesting conversation unfolding here because I keep telling my colleagues and people who report to me about a similar pattern. We see that similarly in music. When you want to like stress on a particular note, you keep everything in the background and you just highlight something very beautiful and you come back to the background bass tempo or something. Yeah, I see like it to be a common pattern. Beautiful. Yeah, maybe before we get into the minimalistic or the reductivistic part, how has your sort of relationship between, say, urban design and architecture evolved, and how has sort of the postgraduate studies that you did in urban design influenced your architecture? I mean, you were just going
Yes.
to talk about it. Yeah.
Yes. Firstly, maybe I should mention every young architect that's worked in my office went on to study urban design or develop a real interest in it, because it's one of those things you don't really appreciate how profound urban design is until you've immersed yourself into it. So this thing about not having the capacity to think about design at the scale of a city or a precinct even, because you're still busy as a student of architecture to get to grips with the basics of architecture. You're still learning to play the instrument. You can't move into a band yet. And so urban design is actually about the band. It's about this integration, about listening and integrating things. So the urban design studies, I studied urban design in South Africa, and then I also studied urban design in the UK. And there are different approaches to urban design, but it's really this thing about what are these complex elements that make up a city? And you can ignore them, or you can embrace them and embrace complexity. And when we get to minimalism, it will be in the context of a complex world. So by doing urban design, you say, well, the world is complex enough. You can't contribute to that complexity more. You have to distill and decide what is that note, just getting it back to music again. What is that note that you have to play within the orchestra? You can't contribute to just making noise. Everything isn't jazz. Because if everything was jazz, it would be different. So urban design is more like a symphony orchestra. We say this thing has all these components in it, and through urban design, you look very differently at architecture, because you see things here, there, now, then. So it brings a dynamic relationship into your view of design, which is not static, it's not object driven, it's process driven. So urban design is always about process. So the competition here is also relevant, because the students are going to be designing something which is part of a process, which was initiated 40, 50 years ago in the construction of that institute on the river there. And now there's a challenge to say, how do I contribute to that process? Howard Correa would have liked me to contribute to that process. But again, we'll get back to that. He certainly had a very strong urban design approach to his work. And for me, urban design, a house is like a small city, and a city is like a big house. I mean, that's a famous quote by Aldo van Eyck, that if you design, and my houses are actually like that, they've got little squares, they've got little streets in them, and so they start assuming those qualities of a small city, because it's all about not the rooms, but the in-between spaces. So it has a big influence in wines, and you do two things. You're actually between being responsive, responding to the past, respecting the past, and being catalytic, looking forward. So urban design mediates between the past and the future, where many architects they in a way prioritize the future, or they prioritize the past. And for an urban design, you will have a problem with both those views, because your responsibility is to mediate. You are just part of a process. You're not going to radically change the world or save it by looking back, or being Elon Musk saying we want to go to Mars. There's something sane and sensible sitting in the middle.
Very beautiful. I remember this quote. I can't pronounce the name, but it's I think Eliel Serenin. And I generally follow that principle in my design practice as well. Ki always design a thing by considering in its next larger context, right? A chair in a room,
Yes.
a room in a house in an environment, and so on. I mean, an environment in a city plan. So I think that's where it's leading to. Interesting.
Good.
Um, cool. In also your couple of articles and whatever little bit I've researched, I found out that you use the word craft, right? And when you are referring in designing, we have a different connotation, at least in India. The craft has has multiple connotations, and again in the digital world, it's like different. Um, would like to know your sort of understanding of craft, because when it comes to minimalism, it's removing stuff, so it's very tough, right? You have ventured into a much more tougher space, uh,
Yes.
because craft little bit it's associated with little bit of ornamentation and many other attributes,
Yes.
so how do you see, and what do you sort of want to say when you say the word craft also?
Yes. Well, thank you. I think thanks for challenging me on that topic too, because I've had that before, where people have asked me, so what's the difference between craft and design? And I think also interestingly, other people have called my work that, not only myself. And there's an article written on my work about my craft, a craft oriented attitude towards building. And maybe the most accurate way for me would be to define this as being more traditional in the way that you make. And again, this has got to do with technology, where a lot of the work that I see done by, say, younger architects in my office or students, is that there's a palette of materials that is available digitally. So things become very superficial. Things just get copied, pasted. Surfaces get introduced onto built form. For instance, I mean, there are these three-dimensional packages, but there's no, or very little, not no, very little appreciation of the brick. And if you look at Louis Kahn's work in India, and he had that famous saying, "Let the brick be what it wants to be," and that's my connection with craft. So
Beautiful.
it's an affinity for the essence of the material. So we're bringing essence and craft into it again. So again, it has a dimension of minimalism, because what I say is just work with the basic materials, not what lands on your desk from a salesman this morning. A fake piece of stone, or a fake finish that looks like timber, or a plastic floor that looks like timber, but if you touch it, it's cold. That sort of thing. That's where I've in a way brought craft into my philosophy, to try and reassert what I actually do in my work. So if you look at my work on my website, where our practices work, we typically like to work with materials that if you touch it, it's real. It's what it is. It is the brick. It doesn't pretend to be the brick, but it's actually something else. And that has come through commercial architecture, where commercial architects, and we've got the profession in South Africa, quantity surveying. I don't know if you've got that in India. It's a British principle. In Europe, they don't have that, in mainland Europe, where they're always trying to save without the consent of the architect necessarily, where they say, well, Mr. Architect, we see your beautiful design. We can build exactly the same building, but we'll substitute your brick with a fake brick, or just a sliver of brick, which is not the full brick. It's just a part of the brick. We stick it onto the wall, and we will do that with a stone, and we will do it with 3 other. And then we save the client a lot of money. And so if the architect doesn't stand on his feet, defend that dimension of architecture, it starts losing ground, because I think even a commercial building has a responsibility to be more permanent, to last more than 10 years, because what then happens, and now we've got laser cutting. It's just a pattern cut into a piece of sheet that looks like a tree, but it's never going to be a real tree. But in 5 years, it starts falling apart because doesn't have the integrity of the wood, the brick, the steel, the authentic original materials. I know that this is questioned from a sustainability point of view, but there's a middle ground again. So what I say is, as a designer, you have to almost have to overemphasize, in our context, the craft side of architect, which is the making and the affinity for the material and an understanding of at least know what the dimension of a brick is. Because when I started studying architecture, that's the first thing you do. You draw a brick, and you put the South African standard, what they call imperial brick. You put the dimensions on the brick, and that becomes part of your memory, and you keep on working with that brick. So a building's height is calculated by a brick. If you go to Louis Kahn's buildings in Ahmedabad, every brick was probably drawn at that time, because every brick is important, and it wants to be that in that space, in that building. Korea didn't do that in what we call face brick buildings, where you can read the brick on the surface, but there are of those. I've got the book next to me of Korea, so they do exist. But you'll find, for instance, Swiss architects like Mario Botta, that you can almost imagine that if you look at a picture of a building that's built, that the drawing in the office was probably a very big drawing, because you need to be able to see every brick in that building. No one brick is cut. For me, that's craft, because it's very easy to cut a brick and then plaster over it. It's like just sort of smearing over it. But you don't actually then appreciate the bones. It's like having makeup, but bad bones. You have to have good bones and the makeup, if one has to use a metaphor for that. So I think in India, maybe culturally, layering things, adding things, because of a very deep history and an appreciation of the past, it's more part of your outlook on how buildings are made. But I'm not going to try and guess what that is, and I will learn more about that again when I'm in India. But I think even there, I'm sure you are challenged, or the architects are challenged, and you have two camps. And I've had a few discussions now with Peter Rich, a well-known South African architect, and others, and that there are these two camps emerging. The one camp which is more interested in what happens in Dubai, and then you've got another camp that's more interested in the way that, for instance, Doshi worked. And again, I'm not saying that that's necessarily correct, but we've got the same here. There are people that studied with me that couldn't wait to get on a plane to go and work in Dubai, and then there are others that would like to work with the local communities, poor communities in our cities. So again, there's a dimension of craft. So if you're interested in craft, you're more interested in the person also that makes it. For instance, when I do a building, I love it when I go to a site, for instance, this campus we did Kimberley, which is a fairly remote province of South Africa, Northern Cape. You challenge the local craftsman, and it's big buildings in a remote location, and you draw something, but you're not quite sure if they can make it. But then you discuss it informally with a person, and it's amazing how people rise to the challenge, which is the craft of that thing. A little steel bench that has a contour in it and whatever, and they don't have the tools or the software or whatever to put it into a computer model, have it printed off-site, whatever technology is used abroad, and then bring it to site. They actually have to make it with their hands still. So, and I think we're fortunate in South Africa to still have a very big component of that. In Europe, they've got the cold, long winter months, so they prefabricate, off-site in factories. It's a modular system, and they just clip the thing together, and 4 people can build a whole building. Whereas we build much slower, and you work with the local skills that often unskilled, low-skilled people that have aspirations in life in terms of their livelihood, their development, their pride. And one has to design for that. You can't design in South Africa as if you're in Switzerland. And I think India, as far as I've been there before, I know it's somewhere in between because it's a very progressive country. It's become very progressive economically. It's an important global player. So there's always going to be this pressure, and it's a tech-savvy country with a lot of people that understand technology and are very proficient at software development and so on. So I think it's an interesting debate to pursue further. Maybe we can have another podcast in the future just about that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you first of all answered one very old question which I had when I was designing my house. It's an apartment, but I was designing the interiors, and the interior designer told me that we can put a veneer on this plywood, and it will look like teak. And I said, but I know that it's not a teak. And we were just like grappling with this question, that is it the look, or is it the craft, or is it the integrity which the material itself has it.
Yes.
So yeah, I mean, you put it nicely. And also, it, if I'm not wrong, it also sort of improves the shelf life of anything that you build if it's built slowly, steadily, and with like lot of thought and craft. Is that correct?
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at Korea's building in Ahmedabad, one of his first buildings, the Gandhi Smarak,
Gandhi
it's an
Smarak.
old building which is now what 60, 70 years old, 60 at least.
Yeah.
It's beautiful. It's more beautiful now than it was when it was built. And why I say that, things get a patina in it. There's a sort of aging of the surface of the concrete and the brick makes it more beautiful. If you have to keep it polished to remain beautiful, there's a problem with it. So you're dead right. If you design with honest materials, then not only do you feel better about what you've used, there's integrity to it. It's not a lie. It's not saying I'm wood, but I'm not actually. I'm talking about. So Louis Kahn's brick would be very unhappy if it was pretending to be brick in Ahmedabad, these buildings there, or in Dhaka. So it's the same for us. And again, I mean, you talk about a veneer on plywood. Sometimes people just stick it straight onto concrete, just a form just a piece of concrete floor. And so you can't actually fool even a layperson because your feet wants to feel the warmth of the timber. If you walk on it bare feet, you don't want to do that on a piece of plastic that's saying I'm timber because it's going to be cold. It's lying to you and it's cold. It's literally cold.
Yeah.
So there's a direct relationship between integrity, lying, being honest, truthful, sustainable, and all of these things. And I think timber is an interesting one because it's a renewable resource. So you can't even use that as an excuse that you can't use timber because concrete, we all know concrete is problematic from a sustainability point of view. But still, for me, I'd rather use concrete than trying to use something that's pretending to be concrete, or I'd rather than use something else. We can't build from timber in South Africa because it's not possible. We don't have forests and so on. I think it's more possible in other countries. I'm very excited by taller timber buildings being built now and so on, because that's taking it back to the craft and the integrity that I'm talking about, which doesn't lie. Tall buildings, 30, 40 stories they're building now in timber, which is amazing. It's fantastic news for me.
Yeah, true. Beautiful. Cool. We'll move on to the next sort of my personal topic. And what I've said so far is the definition of your minimalism or your sort of understanding is slightly different. So I will start there. That how do you define sort of minimalism, or especially the reductivist sort of approach
Yes,
to architecture. And just
yes,
to follow up on that, just before, is that what I've seen is in sort of developing countries like us, India or South Africa, uh, at least in our part of the geography, people, because they were um ruled by the British and have seen poverty at a different scale, and now the money is flowing in. There's economic growth. There's a lot of fancy stuff, shiny stuff seen around. So they want that. And if you sort of build with like slightly different philosophy, how are, and that's why I said, how do you negotiate with this, or how do you sort of acknowledge these needs and yet arrive at a beautiful architecture?
Yes, I mean that point about wealthy people wanting things to be glossy. The Rolex watch, you're not going to just wear any watch. You want to have a Rolex. That still remains the exception, because in a big country of more than 1 billion people now in India, that still remains, and it's the same in South Africa. The inequality is enormous, but I mean, it's the same all over the world. I've traveled a lot. I've been to places like Peru and so on, South America, where you still realize, through your travels and your research, and I've done a lot of research in informal communities and so on. I mean, that separation, it just becomes bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Just the fact that you can do certain things doesn't mean that you must. And that's always my view of things. So the fact that you can wear the Rolex watch doesn't mean that you have to wear the Rolex watch. And for me, the other interesting thing is, if you go to a city like London, for instance, is that their cities consist of row houses. They call them terrace houses, and many people are familiar with London. That is just something that's been there for centuries. It actually comes from Victorian era, but it's also Georgian and so on. But there are so many wealthy people that just live in another house that looks like the neighbor. So they spend their money inside. They don't try to do fireworks on the outside with the house. And anyway, they feel more comfortable with it because it's more private. It's more, people don't latch onto you because you've got money. They don't harass you because you've money. So that's also a choice. The way that people view their money and they desire to express it throughout the world for a long time now. For instance, in the banking sector, banks like to compete because that's a product that's out there. And in India, you'll have all these banks. For them, it's important to say my bank headquarters is cooler, bigger, glossier than the other bank headquarters. So you'll always have that corporate sort of iconic demand. New York is built like that. London's buildings are now built like that. Wealthy people from Dubai invest in London. They want to see their investment in London and boast about their building in London, and so on. So the globalization has, in a way, accelerated that. It's become more pronounced. But for me, that's like perfume bottles. A young girl, this famous urbanist from Denmark, always says, the buildings in Dubai could be the perfume bottles on the shelf. In the airport again. We spoke about the Thai earlier.
Yeah.
It's this thing that you take, you buy the perfume because you like the bottle, not because of what the perfume, it's actually, the perfume is almost irrelevant. So, so sometimes it works for people that because the building is cool, that people bank there. If that works for the bank, that's fine. I don't question that. That's just a business principle. But one shouldn't confuse that with what your brother, my sister, my mother wants for their house. They don't want that. They're not interested in that. Generally, people are not interested in that. So I think, again, now people study architecture, and the biggest mistake they can make is to accept that 95% of people want that. That's not true. Their view, the average student's view of architecture should be more moderate. Because if it's all about becoming wealthy through architecture, I mean, I had people like that studying with me. They told me when they were studying, they're going to do marketing master's degree afterwards. So then you market yourself all the time. I'm the best architect, I'm the best architect, I'm the best architect, whatever. And you put stuff out there and they get clients for that. But it's usually not the clients that I want. For me, the clients that I aspire to having are people that are interested in the meaning behind architecture. And they're not all over. You have to actually go and find them, or they find you. But if you give up in the first year of practice and say, I'm just going to do glossy buildings for a wealthy client, you're never going to get them. For me, the client that understands, appreciates meaning. And you spoke about Doshi when we started in the pre-interview discussion. Doshi is not going to be interested in a skyscraper in Dubai, is he? No, he's going to be interested in the spirituality of the space and the meaning of the architecture, and he still holds on, and he's done that for decades now.
Yeah.
So as I said earlier, I'm a bit old school, but we can't deny that the other side exists. And people call that commercial architecture. When I had my first interview, there wasn't work in South Africa, it was the recession. And so they saw my drawings at the exhibition of the final year, and they gave me an interview, and I was so pleased. I went to the interview, and they said to me, "But would you feel comfortable working in a commercial practice like ours?" I didn't even know what they meant because, and I know very well now what they meant because I know the practice quite well now. It's not about. I mean, mentioned to you earlier that I go back to buildings that I design. A commercial architect generally is not really interested in it because they have to move on to the next one, and they build the machine, and the machine has to be fed. So if you don't keep doing big buildings, you can't feed the machine. So the thing becomes, in a way, self-destructing. And I mean, we haven't discussed my office. I've got a studio. We could have grown to a much bigger practice, but I've purposefully decided I want to be involved more directly with my clients and my projects. So I'd rather do urban design work, which is more conceptual at a big scale. And mostly the buildings are much smaller and not that many. We haven't done that many buildings. So sometimes to have two avenues, as you said, you do podcasts and you do this. And so this thing about having different interests in architecture is a healthy one. To make music and do architecture, and that's interesting, whatever way one does it, or be an entrepreneur on the side, run an Airbnb establishment at home because it gives you more space in practice, that sort of thing. Whereas, as I say, if you're a corporate, that's what you are. You can just as well have been a lawyer firm if you do that sort of architecture. But you can't pretend to be doshi. You can't say after 30 years, say, well, I do this, but I'm also doshi. Maybe you were a bit like Doshi as a student of architecture and had some inspiring teachers and hung onto that belief for a period, but then you go into practice, and that culture then is one which is very different. And again, I'm not saying that shouldn't exist. There's a demand for it, but it's a choice for me has been not to be there. It's also been a choice for Charles Correa not to be there. I read how many projects he actually showed away the other day, that he said no for that project because there was something wrong in the mix of people that was involved. He would then just say, no, I'll just move on to the next project. And maybe he had that privilege of developing a profile in his lifetime that he had these choices. I know most architects don't have that privilege, but it's very. It's all about integrity. Then to say that if we can't do it the right way, then we don't do it at all. And most architects can't say that. If I had 5 partners or 8 partners and 40 people working for me, it's very difficult to say no because you have to think about how you keep this business afloat all the time. So I think maybe I've said enough about that. It's a very interesting topic, and we will again we can carry on forever.
Yeah. In fact, I remember I had the fortune to do the 100th episode with BV Doshi, and I asked him why do we see the same buildings and same steel flyovers and same glass buildings across different small and big cities in India. And he articulated very beautifully. If I ever happen to write a book, I'll definitely put that as like in the first question. He said because architects are no longer poets, they are simply merchants of
Absolutely.
something. I don't know what, but
Commodities.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, but
Yeah.
interesting. You talk about aerial views. I think that's also something that's happened through technology. People don't fly around. We don't levitate. We still walk on the ground at a certain pace. 400 meters in 5 minutes. That is our for since eternity. That's the way we've been moving. Now we've got software that has us fly around, and our clients want that from us. But again, that's not any. There's no test of the quality of architecture by doing it like that. It in fact just distracts us from where it's important. It's that point where the building meets the ground and the street, and where you enter the building, and that immediately, what you see on the ground within 100 meters is all that we are capable of people. We human. So to pretend that we are, extraterrestrials that have come back to Earth through the software is just not real. So because you get bored with that too. If you fly through the thing 4 times, you've more or less seen it. And how many times do you want to do that? Because if you go to the airport, there's a new development, and it's got this loop. And now it's been, they've spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on this animation. But again, there's no guarantee that if you go down into those spaces, like you would in a Korea building, that you would enjoy it. So the human scale starts becoming almost irrelevant in the way that we design buildings in cities.
Correct, correct. Yeah, I mean, this is a very fascinating topic because, as even in one of the other interviews I've covered, the Jane Jacobs philosophy of like eyes on the street. So you need to be closer to everything, actually. Anyway, that will be like a different tangent. So just moving forward on the minimalism or sort of the reductionist philosophy, where do these ideas come from? I mean, I usually thought that exposing bricks or exposing certain concrete was part of the aesthetics, but now you gave a different light to it. So can you just like tell us a bit about where do these ideas come from? Because when in the in my understanding of minimalism, it's you keep removing stuff and you almost reach to the function where the form is almost disappearing.
Mm.
So how do you arrive at that, or anything that you can share about it?
Yes, and I think it's good that you asked me that, because you did right. My definition of minimalism would be different to somebody else's. There's a British architect called John Pawson. If his buildings are published, they white, they cubist, they empty. So there's an approach in architecture called minimalism. But my view is different, and it comes from my urban design background again, which says you must do things incrementally. So you start with the minimum needed to provide what the need is. And it comes again, it's very much a developing country mindset. And then what you then do is you superimpose incrementalism on it. So you've got minimalism, incrementalism, meaning that you start with the ideas that you engage in a process where things grow. So spatially, it's minimalist. Material in terms of material, it's minimal. And we've mentioned the word reductivist too, to say that to make things affordable and not to wait, rather start and start small. There's a saying that we use in Cape Town. One of the famous urban designers here uses the term start small, but in the biggest possible way. Because often you just need that spark. You just need that this is actually happening. It's not, we're not going to wait forever. Even if the money's not there, let's do something. And then you keep on building on it. So that thing about it, and it's very relevant in the context of housing, for instance. It's relevant in the context of campus building. For instance, I mentioned this campus that I've been very active in the Northern Cape, where the first buildings were built around a square. So there's a big plan for the campus, but what the minimalist approach was there, we first have to shape the square. I can mark the square out on the ground, and I can put posters of buildings to be built around the square on it as a minimalist step. In other words, you put the paving in, you plant the trees, you invite the politicians, they unveil the campus. It's happening, and there are pictures of buildings on the edge of the square, for instance, but they're not built yet. But then you build the first buildings that it supports the square. And it's really interesting to go to Kimberley now, to this town, because the students love that space, because it's a very sort of diluted town, which is dispersed and pulled apart through apartheid and so on. So it's not a very cohesive environment. So the campus played a very important role, the new campus, through minimalism, to establish place, to say what is place. And it's not a place which is a building's foyer or auditorium, whatever. It's the little public square. And in fact, if you go to ancient places where they had the agora, the sort of the marketplace, it was on a trade route. And the trade route, the square would be there before most of the buildings. And because of the energy of people, the value got added to that place. And then they started building more and more and more. That is also minimalism and incrementalism. So you rely on the energy of people to create that impetus, that initial catalyst to build. And that's where your minimalism starts. But that is also being transferred into my architecture. If a client comes to me with a house and they've got a site, and the site is bigger than the house that they want and can afford to build now, you say to them, let's do the whole plan, but what is the minimum that we can build for you to be able to live in this house and feel comfortable in it? So the minimalism even applies at the scale of a house. If it's a affordable house for a poor community, the same. It's a starter home. It's interesting again in Korea's work and many other people that work with poor communities that you start again. Sometimes they just start with the services, as certain services, and then they plug, and that's also a minimalist thing. So just to come back to your question in the beginning, it's not really about building, it's about urban design, space, progress, incrementalism. And so, again, if we talk about the competition, we may touch on it again because some things might actually be metaphysical. You just suggest something; they're not actually real; they're not built, and that's also a component of minimalism. So that is something that will challenge the competitors to say, what is. I'm not saying that that's what everybody should be doing. The students are, because there are other educators too. They shouldn't be designing for what I think. But uh, in that context, there would also be a lesser and a greater minimalist approach. And for instance, what would be the minimum that Korea would be happy with? So you say, if you had to now adjudicate this, and say, well, this is the building I did then. I'm generous. Let's give the young designers a chance. What would be the minimum that he would be happy with? That he would say, this hasn't, in a way, compromised the building that I've designed. That hasn't compromised the setting. It actually does exactly what it should be doing. It's not trying to again impress anybody, because again, I mean, that building of his there is quite understated. It's a very low slung, simple, understated building. And it brings us back to the perfume bottle. If you put a perfume bottle in front of the building, maybe that's not the right approach. You ask me, it's a subjective view.
I'm getting like so many ideas here because of your like, yeah, I mean, um, so what I've understood from this is you basically start with like something really fundamental, but does it like just land up in framework and or some sort of a template or some sort of a basic structure, and then let the space organically grow on its own? Is that what you're pointing to?
Absolutely. I think often for undergraduate students, it's very difficult to grasp the concept of a framework. And it's like music. You've got the bars, and then you put the notes in, and that can happen in different ways. So you're not closing down everything. All you're saying is that there needs to be a rigor. Your point of departure need to be solid. And if you design, for instance, say you design an auditorium or a stadium, there are certain things that is going to be part of a framework very early there. And that's the functional side of it. We call it the secret herbs and spices sometimes. A stadium, if you don't design that right, you can't see the people playing sport. So that is essentially a framework. In a city, the framework is essentially the street pattern, which is the infrastructure that goes in first. But if you do that wrong, the whole city suffers in the way that you do it. So if you go to New York, for instance, New York and everybody knows New York, it's a very simple grid, which is it's the same grid right across the Manhattan Island. But it doesn't mean that every corner looks the same, every street's the same. You turn a corner, it's a different place because of the way that the buildings have responded. And then at some point, part of the grid is removed and you've got central parking there. That's a very good example of a framework which comes through infrastructure. If you relate, and it's while we've got the discussion on Korea, I've really enjoyed revisiting Korea's work. So often he starts with a checkerboard. It's just like a grid, a square grid, a simple grid where X and Y is the same dimension. That is his framework. That gives him sanity. It gives him something to work with. And to craft, to bring us back to craft. It looks on plan very simple, but if you go into it, the fact that he's set that order gives him the freedom to then manipulate that order. He moves things up, he moves them down, deletes some of the squares, and he creates serendipity in the space. So the minimalist origin in that case is this very simple chessboard. And it is that game of pieces moving around, and that piece is you and I moving in that space. So it's profound, and architects don't generally work like that. If you do a skyscraper, you have to, because that column grid has to go all the way. The Burj are up. I mean, that building has to have a grid. You can't ignore it. But what I'm saying is, on the scale the Korea's work, which is typically often small to medium scale, sometimes big buildings like a tall building in New York included. That's almost universal. He did this, as I mentioned earlier, this Gandhi Smarak in Ahmedabad. If you look at the plan, it's it's a very simple grid, and if you look at the architects, there's a series of canopies sitting over it. That's minimalism. I look at these pictures, and there's a student in my office here that's just come back from India, and she went all over. She was on a travel scholarship. It's just coincidental, that she just came back, and so she's inspired me even greater. I'm so excited about coming to India. But she says of everything she's seen in India, this was her favorite. And I'm looking at these pictures, and it's so poetic, talking about Doshi's and it's poetic for me because it's minimalist. What I see here is the texture that we spoke about earlier in the material. You see the quietness of the water, which is very typical of Indian architecture and the Hindu temples and so on, which I've visited in Goa in the past. So there's something very sort of significant. And if you ask me where this was, I would probably say it's in India. So there's a very strong connection. But it's very minimalist, and it's got the framework. So then I paced through this whole book. This is the Kenneth Frampton book, the famous book on Korea, which I bought in India, coincidentally. It was just published when I was last there. But I mean, you then go through the whole book, and all the work is done, and they all have that in common. So while we're on that topic, I mean, it's if students that participate in the competition don't read that, then there's something fundamentally that they're missing. Because I just reminded myself of our fundamental values in his work. And that's for me the beauty of it, is that sort of framework, minimalist origin, and there's a game. There's a game to be played. And I can see him in his office, when he was still alive and practicing, that he would do this, and with people around him, he would actually move things around, and he would say, let's move it here and move it there, and let's imagine what the space will be that we create, and let's move this up. And so sometimes the space needs a bigger floor plate. Therefore, you need to lift the ceiling and the roof to make the floor relative to the height. And he was an absolute master of that. If you go to his tower building in Mumbai, I love that building. It's just for me the most, and I actually can't get my head around it. It's so sophisticated. It's like villas in the sky. And I mean, those are exclusive. We talked about the Rolex watch earlier. If I could afford a Rolex watch, I would also like to live in one of those apartments, because I can just imagine sitting there on the 15th floor, and I live in a villa which has a stepped floor, and it feels like I'm on the ground. The way that he's actually, but again, the origin is that very simple grid that runs right through the tower. But then he engages in this game of subtraction. Start that thing, and he subtracts. He doesn't add. So it brings us back to your point earlier about minimalism, layering, complexity, and so on. So within that minimalist order, people bring their own complexity, and he empowers them and allows them to do it. He doesn't say you can't paint a mural on my wall, because a minimalist in Switzerland and in London would say that you can't touch this thing. Your shoes have to be white, your trousers, your shirt, and your tie. You can't change that. Where that's not what Correa would do. He would say, okay, well, that's just the start. Now come with your whatever. And those murals I love, because it's got a sense of humor. It wasn't done by him, and he trusted people to paint on his building, which is great. And again, we will do that in South Africa too. Peter Rich, my colleague, who's actually introduced me to the people, to Professor Nandana and so on. I mean, his work is also like that, and it's in our context, mural painting is very African. It's something that people embellish, and it gives them the personality, their own personalities, then on their building, which is a clay building, and then they paint on it in the Bele culture that Peter sort of explored quite extensively. So therefore, for us, there's a very direct connection, but it's also not happening generally in this country. People also want Rolex watches. So that, I mean, that's universal. That's just part of globalization, that people, because they see it, they want it. It's all over.
Yeah. No, so I think I'll skip the next question, because I think somehow I connected the dot of, because you have a framework, because you give you keep the exploration bit and the place to organically evolve, it automatically becomes timeless because it's constantly evolving. So I was going to ask you, like, one of Urba's sort of philosophy is in search of timeless qualities. I think
Yeah.
I could connect the dot. So I'll ask one last question about the philosophy, and then we'll move to the last piece of Charles Correa bit. So how do you sort of, I mean, if you keep reducing, there is a chance of no, actually that's also void now because you're letting people do everything. Yeah, beautiful. uh, all right, I think we'll move on to the Charles Correa bit. Is that like, when did you hear about Korea first, and how has your work been influenced, or any things that you have learned from uh, Korea's work, which you would like to
Okay.
share?
Yeah. It's. I think the fact that I've been invited to adjudicate is not coincidental. I think the people of Mindspace Architects. Uh, there's a post on YouTube, a talk that I gave, and it's very much about the questions you've just asked. And I think for me there's a connection of my work with Korea. My first sort of real serious engagement with his work was as a master of urban design student at University of the Witwatersrand, which is, you do it, I mean, obviously after doing architecture. 2 years after graduating, I came back, I did that course. And then I discovered Korea's work. And I mean, I'd seen a bit of it as an undergraduate. Um, but then something significant happened. I was invited to design a business school in Johannesburg. It was actually a competition. And there were 5 entries. And the professor said to me that he wants something African. He wants something which is of Africa, and if people visit. Um, and the architecture then, as we discussed in Johannesburg, which is sort of also connected to the world network of global cities, is also this thing about glossy, glitzy buildings and so on. So there's very little of that sort of thing being built at any level, Korea type architecture. But the professor was well traveled, and I then went to a conference in Goa, the Commonwealth Association of Architects Conference, 19, 1997. So I was there, and the conference was in Charles Correa's hotel, the five-star hotel there, the Cidade de Goa, beautiful hotel. Um, I come back and said it was a coincidence. I'd already been invited to participate in the competition, actually with a big practice, because I'd won competitions before. So it's just part of my history of my practice is competition. So they said, "Wouldn't you like to do the concept for us? And if we win it, then we will help you build it." And that sort of thing has worked for me quite well in my practice, staying small, but then working with bigger practices, but controlling the concept. But I then bought this book. I'd been to the conference, and I'd never listened to Correa speak. Days before the internet, really, YouTube and so on, which I've now caught up. It's really nice to go back. I bought the book, and I was there, and I was just completely infatuated by Correa's work. And I saw this building, this institute, that the subject. I walked past that building, quickly went into that. There wasn't much time because it was all about the conference. And then I came back and I said to this professor, "Look at this book here. Look at this fantastic work." And he said to me, "Yes, he loves India. He's been there and he's been to conferences there himself." And he referred to the Red Fort and so on. And so we were on the same page
Wow.
from day one. I'd already won the competition, but with a different design. It was different because the brief was more classical. And so in a way, I mean, so I gave him what he wanted for the competition. And then afterwards, I just started influencing. The word influencer is not new because that's what I did then. In any case, so I then bought him a copy. I ordered a copy for him, and he was then equally infatuated. So that building, unfortunately, we can't share that now, is very Korea. I mean, in the way that we've worked with the space, the courtyards, the sequencing, all those elements in it. Very simple materials, but spatially, and it's become a very it was a new business school. It's become a very popular business school, and it's quite nice for people to say they like studying there because of the spaces and the choices, and I mean the things that are really important in architecture. But again, in terms of minimalism, incrementalism, it was built in 4 phases. So again, we started building a quad, launched quad like Korea's buildings, and then we started adding, and it used to be a suburban area. So what happened, it used to be They bought 4 suburban stands of equal size, and we built the minimum. There was only so much money, and this thing has grown. And I've been involved in all those phases, growing the thing. It's been an absolute delight. This thing about a building being a small city, and it's exactly the same as Graham's work. These buildings are also small cities. In any case, so I came back to South Africa, and then I went to Wits for a lecture that Correa. He then came to South Africa because he was on the competition jury for the Constitutional Court. We participated, didn't win that competition, but it was great to see Correa then at Wits giving his talk. And then many years later, when I was doing my PhD, was in London, and so I went to the London School of Economics, and I told all my fellow students we must go listen to Charles Correa. He was in Oxford. We all went on the bus, and we went to go and listen to him again. And that was for me profound because I mean, you mentioned Doshi. I really love, I speak very fast and say a lot. Just the way that he spoke. He could have spoken in London about all his work. He didn't do that. He just spoke about a very small aspect of his work, like Doshi would also do. And I really admire that in your good architects, that they've got that ability to distill and then talk meaningfully about the wall or the whatever, I mean, some subject topic within it. We've to an extent done it today. The fact that you've focused on minimalism is great for me because usually it's just mixed up with a lot of other things. So we've been focusing on that. But that's the background to Korea. And I've been to go, but I haven't seen that many buildings. So I'm really looking forward to, after the competition, to travel a bit and see more of his work in other cities. This amazing building, you can't call it a building, it's like the landscape in Bhopal. It's always fascinated me, these terraces, beautiful structure. But in any case, that's my connection with Korea. It's actually quite, and this book is always on the surface in my office, this Kenneth Frampton book.
It's so beautiful, and I'm also always inspired and in awe actually of knowing that how these sort of legends are able to zoom in and zoom out so effortlessly. And if you like listen to Doshi's interviews, he's just talking about like very very mundane stuff in a very highly spiritual sense. Like the wall itself is talking, and the shelf is like trans transforming itself every time you look at it. So yeah, it's very
Absolutely.
fascinating.
Yes.
uh, all right, Henry. I think I'll have one last question, which is sort of a cheat code for the students if they are listening for so long, whenever this goes live, is that at the drawing board, um, they are supposed to design a memorial for Charles Correa. Any tips or any sort of cheat code that you can give? What will be your judging criteria, or any specific Charles Correa pattern are you looking forward to? Anything that will help the listeners, whoever is participating.
Yes. Firstly, I must say I listened to a clip, Sanjay of Mindspace Architects gave his views, and I've been looking it
Beautiful.
up. That was very good. So if the students haven't listened to that yet, which is on the website, I think they should all do that. My view of the brief is, firstly, the brief is very interesting, and the fact that it doesn't actually pin down use. I mean, what we call a program in architecture. It doesn't say 3 rooms and this and that and the other. I do think that what is important, and just looking at the existing building and what it is, it's this performing center, and it's sort of an overlapping arts facility, which is from performing art to.
It's Lalit Kala Academy, right, in Goa?
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah. So it's got all these uses in it, which immediately suggests there's always space for more because just in terms of program, the fact that that's there doesn't mean that there can't be a really nice place to do an aspect of art within it. Um, because I think, again, I mean, just linking it back to the use of that's one way of looking at it. The other way is to say, well, maybe it's completely contrasting, and so the fact that the brief is so open-ended, but there's a site and there's a CAD drawing with a blue block on it that says that you have to work in that space there. So just bringing it back to framework, the framework's there with Correa's building, but there's also this thing that Correa put the building down and between the road and the river. I don't know if there's a floodplain, but there's a gradual progression from the building to the river in the way that the building steps down. And what in typical Korea fashion, the building frays at its edges. So it's more solid at the core, and it's almost like it's being opened up at the end. And Korea puts it beautifully. He says it's designed like a breezeway, and his hotel is the same. And we don't have that in South Africa. So I'm so jealous, because everything gets secured, closed, gated. There are security guards and so on. This building, and as my year-out student here says, the buildings, what she really loves about these buildings is that you can actually step off the street, go through them, move through them, and there's a continuity. So, I mean, there are things that are dynamic to work with. And you've listened to my philosophy throughout this podcast. It's always going to be that becomes part of something bigger. And also because Korea was such a great contextualist, because again, it almost looks like that building has always been there. It's so settled, it sits so comfortably on its side, it relates so comfortably to the street, to the river. And so, in a way, one must be careful to block it, to retain that transparency, fluidity of form, which in a way becomes non-building. It's like a tree canopy, the building, which is this breezeway, and then within it, underneath, there are these activities where people do art, and so that structure should, in my view, be a continuation of that spirit. Because again, we said earlier, if Korea had to evaluate this, some entries would upset him, some others he would be sort of, undecided about, and others would really inspire him in an unexpected way. And I think we all, as a jury, that's what we want. We want to be, without preempting it, you got a very open brief, and we're going to have a lot of entries, and the format is that the jury, us, me, Professor Balsawa, and so on, we just involved in the last 10. So the sifting will happen with us not involved. But I'm sure it's going to be it's either going to be quite diverse, or the shortlist will, in a way, sort of support specific ideas that comes from the practice, from Mindspace Architects.
Correct. Yeah, I mean, it's even I would urge all the students to listen to the video by Sanjay Mohe. It's like he's put in very beautifully. All right, I think this is a good note to end this. Thanks, Henry, for sharing your interesting take on minimalism, on architecture. It was really fascinating, and looking forward to meet in person very soon in Pune. Thanks for giving your time.
It was an absolute pleasure, and thanks for the line of questioning. I really enjoyed it.
Awesome, thanks. Thanks for listening till the end. Again, a quick note, the drawing board brings you a competition for undergraduate architecture students who can submit their project ideas on theme of designing a memorial for Charles Correa. Last day to submit your concept is 1st October 2022. More details in show notes and thedrawingboard.in. Thank you. Bye. And that's it from today's Gyan session. For show notes and more Gyan, visit audiogyan.com. And if you wish to connect with me, I am at Audiogyan Moments on Instagram. Until then, take care.
Hello! It's been a great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On This Round is on Me, Gauri is joined by Shweta Nanda. They talk about the financial independence and how it is to be a woman entrepreneur. On Anish Thing, Anish welcomes ultra-marathon runner Shivani Gharat. Shivani shares her journey of how she ran her first marathon, the mindset of a runner, and what it actually takes to run a full marathon. On Cock and Bull, Cyrus, Naveen, Akash and Shreyas talk about the Korean band BTS serving in the military and its repercussions. On Think Fast, Varun and Suchita discuss Wing Greens and their latest acquisitions and about the Indian sexual wellness market. And on Shunya One, Sheila Datya is joined by Dinika Bhatia, CEO and founder of Nuttigritties. They talk about coming from a business family and Dinika's journey in creating healthy and guilt-free snacking. Once again, don't forget to visit our merch store on ivmpodcasts.com. We have some exciting new merch out there for you. Also, do follow us on social media. We are IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And do remember to spread the word about these shows and any other shows you might be listening to. Appreciate them, rate them, and review them wherever you are listening to them. You can also check out all our other shows on youtube.com/IVM Podcasts. And finally, we would like to thank our sponsors this week: Volvo XC40 Recharge, Bumble, Heads Up for Tails, Kotak Privy League Program, and HDFC Mutual Fund. Thanks, guys. Without you, this would not be possible.
Do you often find yourself surrounded by conversations about Web3, blockchain, NFTs, DAOs? What are these terms and how do they affect our future on the internet? So many questions, but don't worry, we've got answers to all your questions. Hi, I'm Eklavya Bhattacharya, and on our show Future Proofing, we try to decode the impact of these future technologies on various industries with experts and tech enthusiasts. Tune into new episodes coming out every Thursday on the IVM Podcast app and the website, or wherever you get your podcasts from.